don't you talk to me? Why don't you talk?
The following presentation is a program of the WHRW Public Affairs Department. The views expressed are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect those of other WHRW station members or station management. Therefore, we advise you to carefully consider whether you or your children should listen. For questions on this public affairs program or any other, you can email publicaffairs@pa@whrwfm.org.
What you're thinking, I will never know. Now's the time for you to let it go.
Hi, this is your host, Emma Hunter, and welcome to the second episode of the Weekday Wellness Update here on WHRW. So, I did not mention this last week, but when I'm not doing this show, I do work as a health educator for Binghamton University's Department of Health Promotion and Prevention Services. And let me tell you, our department is up to a lot of cool stuff. For example, you're going to find our REACH peers. REACH stands for Real Education About College Health. All over campus, they're giving out tips for self-love and Dove chocolate. They're usually sporting these pretty sweet green jackets, so you can stop with them, chat with them for a bit, and enjoy some chocolate. But enough about that. The real reason we are here today is to talk about the topic of the day, which is Title IX. And I am here with none other than Mr. Dr. Andrew Baker, who is the Binghamton University Title IX coordinator. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd kick off the episode by simply defining Title IX, which, according to the Binghamton University website, prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. So I got to admit that when I hear Title IX, I almost always think athletics. That's like my first thought. And I'm guessing this has probably got to do with the history of Title IX or maybe something else. But I'm hoping that you can kind of help me understand the story behind Title IX, give me a little history lesson, and then I put together a pretty cool timeline that I'm hoping you can walk me through. All right?
Sure. So when we say Title IX in our context, what we're talking about is Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act of 1972. Little known fact, signed into law by Richard Nixon, President Nixon at the time. And Title IX, when it was first passed and in its initial enforcement, they really were targeting intercollegiate athletics. Now, Title IX it's a comprehensive set of requirements that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. And when we say sex these days, we mean sex or gender identity, all those things. But Title IX uses the word sex, so it's all in there. But it prevents discrimination by any educational institution that receives federal funding. So Binghamton receives federal funding through student loans and Title IV funding and things like that. So we fall under Title IX. And as you noted, Emma, when it first came out, it was really applied mostly in the athletic venue, making sure that male and female athletes had equal opportunity in sports, or that if they did not, an institution was working towards that goal diligently, or had worked to try and get there, and the interest wasn't there from one sex or the other. So that was its first sort of go around the block in terms of enforcement.
Okay, interesting. So, all right, so I'm going to start with my timeline here. I'm looking at the year 1990 with something called, I believe, the Clery Act. Can you tell me a little bit about this, why it came about?
I can tell you about the Clery Act. Full name is the Jean Clery Disclosure of Campus Security Policy and Campus Crime Statistics Act. And this particular piece of legislation from 1990 came about more or less, or I should say is named after a very tragic occurrence. In that in 1986, a young woman by the name of Jean Clery, while attending Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, was raped and killed in her residence hall room. Her parents found that there were a number of violent crimes that had taken place at Lehigh in many years prior that they were not aware of. So they lobbied for the kind of really Consumer Information Act that could inform people looking to attend institutions whether that institution was a place where there was a lot of crime going on the campus. So that's why the act bears Jean's name, is because the family used the money that they won in court to start an organization to forward these goals. So that's why the act bears her name, and that's a little bit about what the act does.
And is it the university police departments that are responsible for reporting those statistics and updating them regularly?
Who's responsible from one campus to another varies. For example, part of my job, I do serve as the university's Clery Act coordinator. So sort of all things Clery Act eventually, have some contact with me. But I'm not the person who's counting crimes. That is university police with the assistance of student conduct. I coordinate sort of the collection of that, the entry of that information into the institution's annual security report, and the entry and then publication of that information through the federal government's website each year.
And grand scheme, of it, does Binghamton University relatively safe? Can you comment on that?
I think, Binghamton University compares very favorably, I think, with a lot of other institutions out there, or very similarly. If anybody ever wants to go and read through those statistics or read more of our annual security report, if you go to the college's homepage and in the search box you type ASR, it should be the first link that comes up. Will take people right to the annual security report. It's also disseminated to via a beeline announcement out to students and employees every year right around October 1st.
Excellent. Okay. So in 2011, I found this thing called the Dear Colleague letter. From my understanding, it reinforced Title IX's application to sexual harassment, violence, and assault. Can you expand a little on this?
Definitely. So we refer to that as the Dear Colleague letter, but I think it's also important to understand that many federal agencies, such as the Office of Civil Rights that generated this one, generate these guidance documents that go out to most of the times they're sent to college presidents, but we call them Dear Colleague letters because they always start out Dear Colleague. What they really mean is, Dear 4,000 colleagues across the country, here's some advice and some interpretation on the laws that our office is responsible for. The reason that we place so much emphasis on the one from April 2011 is that was a very large rock in a pond with a lot of ripples that came from that letter. In that letter, as you said, they reinforced and emphasized Title IX's application, not just to intercollegiate athletics, as you started the conversation, but also in terms of sex-based harassment. Everything from, words and comments all the way up to sexual assault, sexual violence, those kinds of things. They emphasized that fell under Title IX. They stated very clearly that an institution has an affirmative obligation to act when it finds out that these things have occurred, and that applies on or off campus. It's clear that the institution can't limit its response to these kinds of reports to just passing it off to a law enforcement agency and saying, well, they'll take care of it. There needs to be some kind of affirmative response and acknowledgement on the part of the more administrative wing of the college, the non-law enforcement end. And that particular Dear Colleague letter also listed a number of things that institutions should do to protect victims, disseminate a notice of non-discrimination out to the community, designate and name and make public the contact information for a Title IX coordinator, and to publish prompt and equitable procedures that would be used to resolve things in terms of student conduct and other ways on campus. So that's why we kind of refer to it as the Dear Colleague letter all these years later, even though there have been many others that have been released by the Office of Civil Rights and other offices since that time.
It's the big the. Okay, got
Correct.
it. So then in 2013, the Violence Against Women Act was passed, which basically amended the Clery Act, if I'm not incorrect. So can you explain how?
Well, yes. So in 2012, a new, or did you say 2013? I can't remember what you said.
2013, but maybe, is it 2012?
I think it was 2012.
All right.
The Violence Against Women Act was actually reauthorized. The Violence Against Women Act historically goes back to 1994, and the bulk of the legislation at that point was written by a not-so-well-known senator at the time by the name of Joseph Biden, who then, of course, we all now know as the just recently former Vice President of the United States, who also was responsible while he was in office for establishing the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, which issued three big reports through the time he was there. So that act, again, goes back quite a number of years, not quite as far as Title IX, but certainly back 2 decades now. So In the most recent reauthorization of that, the Violence Against Women Act was applied to several parts of Clery. So this is the part of my job where different parts collide. There's the Clery side and the Title IX side, and then both of them sort of collide when you start talking about the Violence Against Women Act. But when it was first passed, it established a large pot of money to investigate and prosecute crimes against women, the Violence Against Women Act. This makes sense. And also allowed a lot of other things under the law that hadn't previously been there. It established the Office of Violence Against Women within the Department of Justice. If you were to read what it says in terms of Clery these days, it mostly talks about requirements and duties that we have when we know about dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, or sexual assault. And it requires us to have a number of disclosures in our annual security report through Clery. It requires us to talk about a lot of educational programming and preventive awareness campaigns that we offer. It requires us to offer reporting individuals a number of different options when they choose to report something. It notes that we have to help students to the best of our ability with things like obtaining and enforcing restraining orders, protecting confidentiality, providing resources and support. And again, it's very clear that this is an obligation whether these things occur on or off campus. Interestingly, about the Violence Against Women Act, the one thing I like to mention is that it states that a student may bring an advisor of choice to any meeting that they have about anything related to a report that they raise for dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, or sexual assault. So when they say any, they really mean any. It could be someone's friend, someone's counselor, someone's mother, someone's lawyer, someone's mother who is a lawyer. The list goes on. It can be anyone. So that was an interesting part of VAWA.
Okay. And then before we get to the current state of Title IX, would you touch quickly upon enough is enough?
Enough is enough, yes. You'll hear me many times in other presentations call that 129B because that's a section of New York State education law that it's from. But that is from 2015. It's a state law. And the interesting thing about enough is enough is that it establishes a number of things that need to be uniform across all institutions in New York State. So it's an interesting law for us because although we many times get regulations and requirements from SUNY that say all SUNY schools must do this, this law is much broader than that, and it says institutions in New York State must do certain things. So we are held to the same standard as not just, let's say, SUNY Oswego, SUNY Geneseo, SUNY Stony Brook, but also to, all the private schools in New York State, like Cornell, like Ithaca, like Elmira College. So it's interesting that it's kind of gone broader than that and filled in some of the gaps that might have been left open by little pieces of the Violence Against Women Act and Title IX. Really, what 129B, Enough is Enough, does is it adds a more thorough and detailed set of guidelines than what we'd heard in other pieces of legislation. It talks about a uniform definition of consent. It talks about a uniform amnesty policy in cases of drug and alcohol use. It talks about a uniform Bill of Rights, a uniform set of rights that students must be provided by the institution. It establishes that interim measures are up for review by an appropriate process. It assures students that there is a presumption of non-responsibility until a process has been completed by the institution. It does other things like it requires annual training for people like me and people who work in the student conduct office that work on these cases, along with other procedural requirements. And very interestingly, I find the most interesting part is that it provides a very specific and quoted statement that has to be given to students when they report an incident of sexual harassment, discrimination, dating violence, domestic violence, what have you. And it's so specific that in the field we sort of refer to it like people sometimes refer to a Miranda warning, that you have a right to remain silent, anything you say can use. So that's your Miranda warning that we've all sort of come into pop culture with watching all the police-based TV shows. There's a similar statement, I won't quote it for you right now, that has to be delivered to every individual that reports that they've been victimized by one of these kinds of incidents. So that's how specific 129B gets.
So, yeah, not complicated at all. It seems like a pretty intense and meaty Title IX. But you said that, Let's talk about where it's come today. So we talked about enough is enough. I don't know if anything's changed since then, but if you could kind of say in a few sentences what encompasses Title IX right now, what would you say?
What encompasses Title IX right now in just a few sentences?
Or if you could define it. Let's not talk about the Binghamton University definition that's, which is great and good. But if you had to kind of off the cuff define it, how would you do that?
Title IX is, I guess, what I would call the slang that we use for the plethora of laws, regulations, guidelines, and other just generally good things that we do when we learn that someone in our community has been hurt in one of these ways, whether that be something physical like sexual assault, or a quid pro quo kind of sex-based harassment, or anything in between those. So I think that Title IX, if I were to sum it up, it's all the things that we will do and help people do if that occurs to them.
Okay. And for Binghamton University to continue receiving funds, federal funds, and be compliant with Title IX, what do they have to do? And if they don't, do they get a warning, or is the money just taken right away? How does that work?
Well, to my knowledge, no institution has actually lost their federal funding. What could be a trigger for that is if there's an Office of Civil Rights investigation, they would come and they would investigate your institution. Sometimes they do that just like an auditor would randomly select places. Sometimes they do it through just searching websites and looking for things that might catch their attention. Sometimes they'll do it if there's a complaint that makes its way up to them. But they would come into your institution and ask for a lot of documentation that shows what you do, describes how you do it, and provides examples of that. They would then take that and compare it to their set of standards, what they think we should be doing in their interpretation of the law. And at the end of that, they would issue a letter that says, we find that you're in compliance with this, but we recommend the following things be, beefed up or reinvigorated. Or they would say, we find these deficiencies in your system that we think you have, and we're going to have you do these things to make up for that. And to my knowledge, as long as schools go willingly down one of those two paths of making any changes the Office of Civil Rights suggests at the end of their examination of you, then you're not at risk for losing any kind of federal funding. So it's a very, they like to offer you a lot of carrots before they get to the stick part of that equation.
That's good. So let's think, Binghamton University and your role here. Can you tell me a little bit about your duties and about your department? Is this, are you a one-person department, or do you work with other departments, or kind of give me an idea of what it looks like?
Well, I'm kind of a one-person department and kind of not. So I work in the Office of Risk Management, and there's 4 of us there in that office currently. There's the director, there's the assistant director, there's myself, and then there's an enterprise risk management person who joined us fairly recently. So that's the Department of Risk Management, and we work right for the president's office. As far as people who do Title IX type work and work in that realm, I interact more with people in other departments. So I interact a lot with the Dean of Students office, the case managers under the Dean of Students office. I interact a lot with the Student Conduct office and the folks who work there. I interact with university police in terms of receiving reports and finding information on the Title IX end of things. On the Cleary end of things, it's a lot of the same people who are providing information, helping to craft policy statements for the annual security report, and collecting those digits at the end. So what I do is a lot of coordination work, making sure that the right people are coming together at the table, that the right decisions are being made to help students, and following through on those things that need a little extra follow through.
And so how did you come into this role? I mean, how long, I don't know how long the role of Title IX has existed, but what got you interested in this? How did you make your way here?
Well, I guess the institutions have been required to have a person designated as Title IX coordinator to fulfill those responsibilities for greater than a decade now. The Office of Civil Rights has been clear about that. It's only been in the recent few years since we talked about the things we talked about before that institutions have sometimes felt the need to have a designated person, which obviously since I'm here, I think that's a good choice. So what brought me to this is I spent a number of years working in residence life and then a number of years working in student conduct before coming to this position. I was in student conduct when these recent laws we discussed were penned, signed, approved, or updated in the case of some of them. And I was working at a small institution at the time. There weren't a lot of people there to tell me what that meant for me in my role. So I had to do a lot of work to go out and learn that on my own. And after that time, after the 4 years or 3 years of working through that cycle, I found that I had a pretty good skill set in the area, along with a bunch of my other colleagues from around the state. And there's a number of us that have gone from sort of the student conduct realm of things into the Title IX realm because we sort of lived through what it meant to make those changes and lived through what it meant to deal more directly with students maybe than I do now in those kinds of situations and in that kind of a role. So my education sort of led me here, and then Binghamton had the job posting open, and here I am.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we're lucky to have you. So I'm thinking in the last 10 minutes, we can really kind of talk about how Title IX applies to our students here at Binghamton. So, I mean, here's a big question, but why do you think it's important that college students understand Title IX?
Well, I guess that, like any right or protection that students have, if they don't know it's there, then they won't know that they can ask for it, and they won't know that there's really a large number of people here at the institution willing to help them in the ways that they want or choose to be helped. So, to me, it's sort of, if you don't know what resources are out there, you don't know what things might be able to help you be successful while you're here.
Yeah. And so if someone were to come to you with a situation, are you confidential? Are you private? I know that can be kind of confusing sometimes. Maybe you could give us an example of a scenario in which a student would utilize your services and then explain if you're private or confidential in your response to that.
Sure. So students could choose to come to my office for a number of reasons. One might be to report a specific incident, but students can also come to my office, or groups come to my office and request information, request a meeting or a training if they want to learn more about something. I've gone out and met with student groups. I've met with academic departments. I've met with individuals. I try to be very responsive to those kinds of things because part of my role is serving as an educator and teaching others in the community about the things we're talking about right now. But I am one of the places that a student can come directly and report anything that they think might fall under a Title IX kind of a situation. And in that role, I serve as a private resource, meaning that I do not have the privilege of confidentiality. I cannot completely withhold all the details and names of people who were involved. In my case, it's a very limited number of people that I would ever have to share that with. But I do not have the privilege of confidentiality like someone would if they were a licensed mental health counselor operating under their license, or a licensed healthcare provider operating under that license.
And are your services, do they cover just student-to-student situations or student-to-employee or employee-to-employee? And how about also, while we're talking about that, does it cover both on and off-campus situations?
Sure. I'll go in the reverse order.
Sounds good.
It covers all situations, regardless of where they occur.
Great.
So if something comes to our attention that occurred here on campus, or if something occurred down on State Street, the response we would have would be very, very similar to that. Depending on what the student wanted, there might be some issues related to which jurisdiction, police department, they would choose to report that to if they wanted to report that. And now I'm blanking on the first part of your question.
Oh, is it just student to student?
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I would be involved or knowledgeable of any situation that occurred, whether it was all student, part employee, or all employee.
Okay.
So in that sense, I work also with the Office of Human Resources and the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in working through issues that may involve an employee here.
And one thing that I could see maybe being of concern is, does Title IX protect students or employees or whoever against retaliation?
Yes, it does. And in subsequent guidance to what we talked about from the Office of Civil Rights, they talk about really what that means. And they enumerate different ways that institutions may choose to step in and help protect people, either when retaliation has occurred or when we think it's very, very likely to. It's really difficult to go down into the details of what those things would be and what that would mean because they're so situation specific. most situations involve a very small number of people and a very private set of facts. And without sort of getting into those, it's hard to say exactly, how we would respond. But the short answer to your question is yes, retaliation is covered under Title IX, again, regardless of whether it's on or off campus.
Okay, great. And what do you think? I know I already probably stole the athletics one, but what do you think the biggest misconception is surrounding Title IX? Is there anything you want to correct? You've got a mic, you've got a platform. What would
I
it be?
think that one of the biggest perceptions about reporting Title IX type events, so again, we're talking about any kind of sex-based discrimination, harassment, violence. I think the biggest misperception is that once we at the university find out about it, we're immediately going to run off and start doing things. We're going to be chasing people across campus and running them through student conduct processes and, calling the police on them when that's not what the reporting individual wants. I think a much more accurate statement would be that within the guidelines that we have to follow from the federal and state government, our primary goal is to try and do what our reporting individual wants. They're coming to us because they want or need something. We want, to the best of our ability, whenever we're able, we want to deliver that to them. Many times these situations you're dealing with an individual who's had a great deal of power and control removed from them, perhaps all power and control removed from them. And it's a very long-standing practice in those situations to try and return as much of that as you are able to them. So I think that is our goal and or misconception sort of wrapped into one, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it sounds like you provide support and, help in walking through it in a slow, meaningful, step-by-step manner, which I think would make it a lot less scary. And finally, Andrew, how do you hope to see Title IX moving forward in the future?
Well, again, sort of thinking of quote-unquote Title IX as all these pieces of legislation together collectively. I certainly hope that we're going to continue doing the things that we're doing in terms of response. I would like to see the outreach grow. I would like to see more groups coming to people like myself, like REACH that you mentioned before, like 20 to 1, asking for training for their class or their particular student organization. Again, back to my comment about you have to know what's out there, you have to know what these things are and how it works before you can really utilize them. So that's one place I think I would like to see it grow. I would like to try and see the culture of reporting increase. We can't work on the campus climate if we don't know what the campus climate is. We can't fix things that we don't know we need to fix. So the more information we can collect and have from people, the more it enables us to respond not just in a specific situation to a student or two, but to our overall student population as a whole.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, if listeners wanted to get more information about Title IX or get in contact with you, what would you suggest?
Sure. I would suggest there's a couple real good resources here on campus. One is my website that if students wanted to go there, anybody wanted to go there, they could find out a lot of this information and contact for me. The other one I would recommend is the Interpersonal Violence Prevention website, and you can find that by going to the college's homepage, typing IVP in the search box, hitting return. It'll be the first one that comes up. And if students were interested, they could go there. There's a lot of information there about resources, support, advocacy, referral. There's also a SUNY-wide designed website called the SUNY SAVR. And if you go to Google and type in SUNY SAVR and hit return, that will be what comes up. So these are all very easy to find things, which makes them nice. If anybody ever wanted to seek me out directly, it's abaker@binghamton.edu. It's 72486 is the number, and I'm in Cooper Administration 217.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That's about all the time that we have.
Thank you.
But thank you for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge about Title IX. This is your host, Emma Hunter, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday at 4 p.m. for the Weekday Wellness Update on WHRW.